I still remember that afternoon as if it were carved into my flesh, when everything inside me shattered in just a few seconds. I, Emily, 65 years old, once believed that my son, the child for whom I sacrificed my entire life to raise, would be my final pillar of support in old age. But here, in this glittering New York apartment, all that faith turned to ashes. I moved in with Lucas, my son, to help take care of James, my 6-year-old grandson, the tiny flicker of light left in my life. I asked for nothing, only to make sure he ate well, studied properly, so my son and his wife could go to work with peace of mind. But I never expected that goodwill to become a reason for them to trample on me. That day, Mia, Lucas's wife, once again went out to party with her friends. At noon, she sent a hasty message: "Feed the boy whatever you want, I'm going out for a bit." But I knew well that this bit usually stretched until midnight. James sat in the living room, clutching his teddy bear, eyes fixed on the door. "Grandma, where's Mom?" he asked. I soothed him, swallowing the lump in my throat. What kind of mother abandons her child like that? By evening, when Mia returned in her short dress, reeking of perfume, I couldn't hold back any longer. I spoke, trying to keep my voice steady. "My dear, James needs his mother. If you keep going out like this, he'll be lonely, starved of affection." Mia smirked, as if my words were nothing but air. "Worry about yourself. This is my house," she said, each word dripping with contempt. Before I could react, Lucas stepped out of the bedroom. His face was flushed, his eyes burning with fury. I thought he would scold his wife, but no. He lunged at me, his rough hand clamping around my neck, forcing me back against the cold wall. "Don't you dare yell at my wife," his growl sent chills down my spine. I was so stunned I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my eyes bulged, my mouth gaped, choking out ragged sounds. My hands clawed at his arm, begging him to let go, but his grip only tightened, as if he wanted to crush my aged throat. In that moment, images of the past flooded back. I saw myself at 20, cradling him in my arms, staying awake all night to soothe him. I saw myself working night shifts at the factory, sweat dripping onto the cold concrete floor, just to afford milk and books for him. All those sacrifices now repaid by the very hand strangling me. Mia stood by, arms crossed, her eyes filled with satisfaction. She didn't try to stop him, instead, she seemed to revel in the scene. I understood then the hatred in her eyes had long seeped into his blood, waiting for the day to erupt. When Lucas finally released me, I collapsed onto a chair. My throat burned, my breath came in jagged gasps, a fit of coughing racking my body. My fingers rubbed the bruised skin, tears streaming uncontrollably. James, my poor grandson, ran to me, clutching me, sobbing, "Grandma! Grandma!" His cries tore through my heart. I feared the terrifying image he had just witnessed would etch itself deep into his young memory. Lucas turned away, as if nothing had happened. Mia stepped closer, resting a hand on her husband's shoulder, whispering just loud enough for me to hear, "You did the right thing." She needed to learn her place. I stared at them, my son and his wife, and could no longer recognize them. This was not the boy I had raised, taught, trusted to love his mother unconditionally. He was now a stranger, willing to choke the woman who gave him life to defend his wife's selfishness. I sat there, trembling, coughing, crying. I felt my old age being hurled into a dark abyss. Every gray hair, every wrinkle, every lifetime of sacrifice, all reduced to humiliation. That night, I lay on the small couch in the living room, the space they had set aside for me, like a tenant. I couldn't sleep. Each time I closed my eyes, my son's hand appeared again, crushing my throat, jolting me awake. I heard James whimpering in the next room. Surely he too couldn't sleep after such horror. I turned to the wall, pain choking my chest. I whispered to myself, why did it come to this? Where did I go wrong? And yet, in my weakest moment, I told myself, I must endure, for James. As long as he was with me, as long as he wasn't abandoned, I still had a reason to stay. But deep down, I knew, the moment his hand closed around my neck was a turning point. The beginning of a new tragedy, a nightmare I would have to face. And also the moment a seed was planted within me, the seed of resistance, of a day when I would have to rise up, not just to protect myself, but to save James from this darkness. After that horrifying night, Lucas's apartment was no longer a home. It was a cage, tight and suffocating, where I was trapped between scorn and silence. The next morning, I stepped into the living room, the bruises still dark on my neck. I thought of speaking to my son, hoping he might reconsider, hoping for an apology, even a flicker of remorse. But no. Lucas sat on the couch, scrolling on his phone, as if nothing had happened. I froze there. The son I had entrusted all my faith to chose to ignore his mother's pain. Mia strode through the kitchen, her voice sharp with arrogance. "Emily, clean these dishes. I have to get ready for my appointment." I bit my lip, hands trembling as I carried the basin of dishes. In her eyes, I was no longer a mother-in-law, but a maid without pay. James sat at the table, staring at me with wide, bewildered eyes. I could see confusion there, and a hint of fear. Day by day, Mia grew more triumphant. She piled chores onto me, mopping, laundry, picking up James. I did it all, not out of fear of her, but because I wanted to protect my grandson. Yet inside, humiliation gnawed at me. Lucas remained coldly silent. He never spoke of the choking, never looked me in the eye. To him, it was over, but for me, the wound bled endlessly. Many times I wanted to say, "Son, do you know that every night I wake in panic from that memory?" But I didn't dare, afraid his answer would be more indifference. One night, our neighbor, Mrs. Rose, who had heard the shouting, came by and asked softly, "Emily, I heard noise last night. Is something wrong?" Startled, I forced a weak smile. "No, just a small misunderstanding." I couldn't tell the truth. I feared being seen as a helpless mother, feared people knowing my son treated me like that. That shame I swallowed, buried deep. After that, I often ate alone. Lucas and Mia dined together, laughing about shopping, about parties. I sat quietly with my bowl in the corner, a shadow. No one asked what I thought, no one cared what I wanted. I had vanished from this family, even while still within its walls. Mia often said bluntly in front of me, "You're just a guest in this house. Don't interfere with our lives." Her words stabbed into me. I had sold my house in New Orleans to pay off Lucas's tuition debts, to give him this life, this apartment. And yet now, I was pushed aside, an uninvited guest. At night, I lay still, my pillow wet with tears. I remembered those years of struggle, carrying the family after my husband's death, working night shifts, my hands calloused from machines. All of it, only to secure a future for my son. But now, that son had become the man who strangled me with his own hands. Worse, James began to drift away from me. He started to repeat his mother's words. "Mommy says grandma is bad." Every time I heard that, it felt like someone was slicing into my heart. I wanted to hold my grandson, to tell him that I loved him more than my own life, but I knew Mia was feeding his mind every single day. I was afraid that one day, James would look at me with hatred in his eyes. In that apartment, I was rendered invisible. I worked, I existed, but no one acknowledged me. All I could hear were the laughs and conversations of those two, while I myself was drowned in solitude. I felt as if I were slowly being erased from my own son's life. Mrs. Rose would sometimes find ways to ask me, "Emily, if your son isn't treating you well, you can come stay at my place for a while." But I shook my head. I couldn't leave James behind. I feared that if I left, the boy would grow up deprived of affection, would believe that his grandmother was truly bad. I couldn't let Mia have full control of raising him. So I endured. Day after day, I swallowed my humiliation, hid the bruises, hid the tears. But the more I endured, the clearer it became, this wasn't a family anymore. It was a deep pit where people crushed each other just to survive. Every time I saw James sitting in a corner, drawing pictures in nothing but gray, I shuddered. I wasn't just losing my son, I was at risk of losing my beloved grandson too. And in my fitful dreams, Lucas's strangling hand returned, haunting me without mercy. The days after the violence were days I died slowly, silently. But somewhere deep inside, a small flame smoldered. I knew I couldn't live like this forever. One day I would have to escape, or my whole life would be buried in the darkness my own son had created. In the days that followed, a suffocating silence still hung over the apartment. I tried to endure, thinking things would calm down, that Lucas might one day realize his mistake. But I was wrong. Instead of easing, his cruelty escalated, and Mia became even more brazen. That day, dinner had just ended. I was washing dishes in the kitchen, the smell of grease and soap mixing until it made me dizzy. James was doing homework in his room, while Mia was once again getting ready to go out with her friends. I heard the click of high heels, the mocking laugh. I blurted out, unable to hold it back any longer. "Mia, you should spend more time with James. He needs his mother, not just his grandmother." I hadn't raised my voice, but those words were like a spark igniting a barrel of oil. Mia spun around, eyes blazing. "Shut up. You're old, worry about yourself. This is my house, I'll do whatever I want." I froze. Those vicious words cut into my heart like knives. But before I could respond, Lucas stepped out of the bedroom. His face flushed red again, just like the night he choked me. Without a word, he lunged toward the sink. In an instant, he grabbed the basin full of soapy, greasy water with dishes soaking in it and hurled it straight at me. My whole body jolted. Dirty water, grease, and soap splattered everywhere, drenching me from head to toe. I collapsed onto the wet tile floor. The stench of grease rose up, choking me. My eyes stung from the soap. I rubbed and rubbed, but the more I rubbed the more it burned. While I was trembling, James came running from his room. He screamed. "Dad! Stop! Don't do that to Grandma!" The boy's cries echoed through the apartment, stabbing straight into my heart. But Lucas stood there, unmoved, and Mia let out a mocking laugh, her voice dripping with scorn. "Serves her right. Let her learn to keep her mouth shut." I lifted my face to them, my eyes blurred with soap and tears. My body shook violently, my soaked clothes clinging to my skin. I tried to get up, but my legs felt drained of all strength. James rushed to me, his tiny hands trembling as he wiped the dirty water from my face. His eyes were red, terrified. I held him, my hands trembling, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart, it's okay." But I knew very well, nothing was okay. This scene would haunt the boy forever. At that moment, I heard knocking at the door. It was Mrs. Rose, the neighbor. She must have heard the shouting. I caught a glimpse of her shadow through the crack. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my throat was locked. Fear surged. If I spoke, if I let Mrs. Rose witness this, would Lucas lose control completely? Would he throw me out on the street, leaving James alone with Mia? I chose silence. I turned my face away, signaling James to stay quiet too. After a while, Mrs. Rose left. The apartment fell into a dreadful silence again, broken only by my choking sobs and James's cries. Lucas tossed the basin into the sink, his voice curt. "Don't you ever meddle in my wife's business again, you hear me, mother?" All I could do was nod, my heart in shreds. I had no strength left to fight back. In my son's eyes at that moment, I was no longer his mother, I was an obstacle, someone deserving of humiliation. That night, I sat alone, my clothes still damp, the smell of grease still clinging to my hair. I looked into the mirror, seeing a wrinkled face, swollen red eyes, streaks of soap still staining my skin. I no longer recognized myself. The woman in the mirror looked ruined, like a ghost. I asked myself, how could my son do this? How could the child I once raised with blood and tears turn into someone so cruel he'd dump a basin of dirty water on his own mother? That night, I couldn't sleep. I only heard James sobbing in his room. Surely he still hadn't forgotten the horrific scene. I clenched my teeth, swallowing my tears. But inside me, a deep crack had formed. I understood now that I was living in a vortex of abuse, sinking deeper every day. Every action of mine, no matter how small, could become an excuse for them to torment me more. I was being pushed to the edge of endurance. But what hurt me most wasn't the dirty water, wasn't the humiliation. What hurt the most was James's eyes, the eyes of a powerless child, witnessing his grandmother being tormented by his parents. I feared that one day, he would believe what he saw was normal. And I couldn't let that happen. At night, I opened my journal again, my hands trembling as I wrote, "Today, my son dumped a whole basin of dishwater on me." Mia laughed. James cried. I am no longer a mother, no longer a person, just a trampled shadow. I closed the notebook, pressing it to my chest. In the dark, I could hear my heart beating slowly, as if to remind me, "Emily, you're still alive. But how much longer will you go on enduring?" The night after being doused with that basin of dishwater, I sat alone in the dark, my damp clothes draped over a chair, the smell of grease still clinging to me. My hands trembled as I opened my journal, but they weren't steady enough to write. Tears fell onto the blank page, blurring the words. I couldn't write anymore, only feel the pain pressing against my chest, ready to explode. And then, like a reflex, I closed my eyes and let the memories flood back. They weren't pleasant memories, but they were the only source of strength helping me understand what I had endured. I remembered when I was just 21, after giving birth to Lucas. His father died early, leaving me with a tiny baby in my arms. I had sat by the window of our small house in New Orleans, looking out at the night sky and telling myself, no matter what, I will raise him to be someone. I had sworn to myself I would take his father's place, protect him all my life. Those days working as a textile factory worker in the suburbs of New Orleans appeared vividly. Endless night shifts, the roar of machines so loud my ears rang. My calloused fingers bled from pricks and cuts from fabric, but I never complained. I thought, just a little more pain, and Lucas would have another can of milk, another notebook. I still remember the misty mornings, after long overnight shifts, when I would take Lucas to the small park near our home. He had just begun to toddle then, laughing gleefully as I pushed the old wooden stroller. In his eyes, I saw the future, I saw hope. I forgot my exhaustion, forgot the calluses on my hands, just to see his smile. When Lucas was 18, he was accepted into a university in Chicago. I cried tears of joy. But that happiness came with an unbearable financial burden. I had no choice but to sell our ancestral home, the place where my husband and I had lived, the place overflowing with memories. I signed the deed with trembling hands, but comforted myself inside, my child will have a bright future. Another house can be bought again, but education cannot. Lucas cried when I handed him the train ticket and the suitcase. He hugged me and whispered, "Mom, I promise I'll take care of you for the rest of your life." That promise had once been the guiding light that carried me through my darkest years. I believed, I told myself that every sacrifice was worth it, that my son's future would be the reward for the youth I had lost. But now, looking back, those promises have become a double-edged knife, cutting deep into my heart. He had once promised to care for me all his life, and yet now, those same hands hurled a basin of dirty water over me. Those same hands that once held mine tenderly as a child now tightened around my throat until I couldn't breathe. Mia knew my past well. Many times, she looked at me with an expression half pity, half contempt, and spat out cruel words. "You're always bragging about your sacrifices. Being a factory worker isn't such a big deal. Everyone has to work." Those words left me stunned. I never bragged. I only wanted Lucas to remember that his mother sacrificed her whole life so he could have today. But it turned out that sacrifice meant nothing. It even became an excuse for Mia to sneer at me. Each time I remembered the sleepless nights in the factory, I felt foolish. I had poured all my savings, my entire youth, our ancestral home, everything to be repaid with the ingratitude of a son. I didn't know where I had gone wrong. Had I raised him with too much unconditional love? Was that why he grew into a selfish man who saw his mother as a burden? The guilt replayed in my head like a sad refrain. Where did I go wrong? There were nights I dreamed of being young again, dreamed of Lucas as a schoolboy running to me, beaming with a perfect score on his math test, hugging me with an innocent smile. In my dreams, I cried tears of happiness. But when I woke, I found myself alone on a narrow bed, listening to Mia's laughter in the living room, and the memory became another knife. I understood then that those beautiful days existed only in my memory. Lucas today was no longer the innocent boy he once was. He had chosen his wife, chosen cruelty, and buried every promise he had made. I clenched my journal, telling myself, Emily, you have spent a lifetime sacrificing. If you are to live the days you have left, you cannot live them only to be trampled. The memories of the past pained me, but they also awakened me. I had given everything, now I had nothing left to lose but my dignity. And I knew that one day, I would have to stand up to reclaim it. After those endless memories haunted my mind, I realized the present was even more painful. This apartment in New York was no longer a home. It had become a battlefield, and I, the mother, had been cast as the enemy. James, my little grandson who once clung to me, was gradually drifting away. I didn't blame him, because I knew who was planting poisonous words in his head. One afternoon, I brought him a comic book I had bought at the market, hoping to make him happy. He hesitated, then softly shook his head. Mommy says Grandma is bad. I was stunned. The words of a 6-year-old weren't his own. I looked into his eyes and saw innocence clouded by doubt. I held him close, trying to cling to what little remained. Grandma loves you, sweetheart. No matter what anyone says, you will always be Grandma's light. But James pulled away and ran into his room, leaving me alone with my shattered heart. Lucas grew more and more distant. He believed his wife, believed her so completely he no longer heard me. Whatever I said, he brushed aside. One day I gently reminded him, James needs to sleep early so he can go to school tomorrow, and Lucas shot me a cold look. Stop lecturing us. This is my wife's and my house. I fell silent. I understood that I was only a shadow, no one wanted to listen. Mia no longer hid her contempt. She openly declared in front of the whole family. If you can't stand it, just go live on the street. Nobody's keeping you here. I sat still, my hands trembling around a cup of cold tea. I thought of the ancestral home in New Orleans, the one I had sold to pay for Lucas's education. And now, in the very apartment I had helped make possible, I was called extra baggage. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier by the day. Meals that should have been warm became silent executions. I sat at the corner of the table, hearing the clatter of forks and knives, listening to Mia and Lucas talk about luxuries, while James sat silently, his eyes empty. I tried to smile, but it came out twisted, meaningless. Mrs. Rose, the neighbor, often looked at me with worried eyes. One day she came over, put her hand on my shoulder, and whispered, Emily, you can't endure this forever. If they don't respect you, leave. Don't bury yourself in this hell. I gripped her hand tightly, choking out. I can't leave James. If I go, my grandson will grow up in darkness with no one to protect him. Mrs. Rose shook her head, her eyes full of sorrow. I knew she was right, but I also knew my heart wouldn't let me turn away from that innocent child. Little by little, James began to look at me with a mix of pity and fear. He was too young to understand, but old enough to sense that his grandmother was being pushed aside by both his parents. I saw him restless, saw him hesitate when he wanted to come to me but stopped short, afraid of being scolded. Each time, it tore me apart. At night, I sat before my late husband's photo and cried. I spoke to him as if he were still alive. Darling, I've done my best. I've sacrificed my whole life for our boy. How could he turn out so cold? Can you see? I'm being erased from his life. Each time I thought of the years I struggled to raise our son, a mix of anger and despair welled up inside me. The love I gave my son had been trampled, and the love I had for my grandson was being stolen piece by piece. I knew this divide could no longer be mended. Between me and my son stood an invisible wall, built from Mia's hatred and his ingratitude. I couldn't break it down, no matter how much I cried out. In this apartment, I was no longer a mother, no longer a grandmother. I was just a shadow, a surplus being. But deep inside, I began to realize, to save what was left of myself, I needed a different step. A new path, even if I didn't yet know where it would lead. That night, when James was asleep, I sat writing in my journal, "Family, the thing I once guarded with blood and tears is now shattered. I have lost not only my son, but also my little grandson. But I will not let this division consume me forever. One day, I must rise." I put my pen down, closed my eyes, and let the tears run down my cheeks. I knew the dark days were still ahead. But in my heart, a small flame had begun to flicker. I thought the humiliation had reached its limit, that nothing worse could possibly happen. But I was wrong. The cruelty of Lucas and Mia seemed to know no bounds, and one fateful afternoon I endured a terror so deep that even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the burning pain on my scalp, still hear James's screams echoing in my ears. That day, the New York sky was gray, drizzle falling on the balcony. I sat in the living room folding James's clothes. The boy had just come home from school, his little face weary. I asked him, "James, how was school today?" He mumbled an answer, then turned away, as if afraid someone might hear him. I knew he was afraid of his parents scolding him for talking too much with me. My heart tightened. I wanted to comfort him, to protect him from Mia's neglect. That afternoon, Mia went out again. When she came home, I couldn't hold back anymore. I said straight out, "My dear, James needs you more. He's only 6, you can't just leave him like this." Mia's face hardened, her tone sharp. "What do you know? I'll raise my son my way. Stop preaching to me." I couldn't keep it in, all the resentment that had been bottled up burst out. "You don't deserve to be a mother. A real mother would never abandon her child like this." Before I could finish, I heard the door slam open from the bedroom. Lucas stormed out, his face flushed, his eyes blazing. Before I could say another word, he lunged at me. "How dare you talk about my wife like that?" Before I could step back, his hand gripped my hair. He yanked so hard my scalp burned as if it were being torn apart. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed in the small apartment. He dragged me toward the balcony, ignoring my struggling, ignoring my trembling pleas. Every pull felt like my hair would be ripped from my head. The pain made my vision blur, tears streaming as my hair tangled in his fist. James saw and rushed forward, crying out, "Dad! Let Grandma go!" His sobs filled the apartment, tearing the air apart. But Lucas didn't stop. He hauled me all the way to the balcony and shoved me so hard I staggered against the railing. My body shook. I thought that with just one more push, I would fall into the abyss below. I clung desperately to the railing, stammering through my tears. "Lucas, what are you doing? I'm your mother." But his eyes were cold, staring at me like I was a stranger. I couldn't find even a trace of the son I once knew. Down in the courtyard, I heard the commotion. Neighbors looked up and saw the horrifying scene. I saw their horrified eyes, their pointing fingers until Mia rushed in, slammed the balcony door, and yanked the curtains shut, as if to hide it all. Lucas suddenly let go, and I collapsed onto the cold tile floor. I gasped for air, my throat parched, my scalp searing. I curled into myself, clutching my head, terror spreading through every nerve. I thought, if he had shoved me just once more, I would already be lying broken on the ground below. James cried hysterically, throwing his little arms around me, his hands trembling as he held me. He looked at his father with pure fear in his eyes. I saw in my grandson's gaze a wound so deep it would mark him for life. Lucas panted heavily, then turned and walked back to his room, leaving me trembling on the floor. Mia followed him, whispering something, her glance at me filled with contempt. I lay there, listening to the rain patter on the balcony, listening to my heart pound erratically. In that moment, I knew I had reached the peak of violence. It was no longer insults, no longer dirty water thrown in my face. This was death hovering, ready to strike at any moment. That night, after I managed to crawl back to the living room, I lay curled up, my body aching. My scalp burned, strands of hair scattered across the pillow. I stared at the ceiling, asking myself, had I been wrong to stay? Was I a fool to believe my son might change someday? But then I thought of James. The sound of his crying still echoed in my ears, every desperate "grandma" stabbing my heart. I couldn't leave him. I couldn't let him grow up in this hell without anyone to protect him. I opened my journal, my hand trembling as I wrote, "Today, Lucas yanked my hair and dragged me to the balcony. I thought I was going to die." James screamed. The neighbors saw, but Mia hid everything. I no longer believe I have much time left, but I know I must find a way to escape. If I don't, I will die in this house. When I put the pen down, I pressed my face into the page, my tears blurring the ink. I knew that after today, there was no turning back. Either I would rise, or my own son would push me into the abyss. After the afternoon when he dragged me by my hair to the balcony, I felt as though I had stepped fully into a darkness with no way out. Each morning, strands of hair on my pillow reminded me that I had hit rock bottom of humiliation. But it was at that bottom where I felt the depth of my absolute loneliness, a silence so heavy that every sound in the house felt foreign. The next day, I tried to stand, but my back throbbed and my head pulsed like needles stabbing into it. I wanted to go to the pharmacy for painkillers, but Lucas said indifferently, "Make a scene and I'll cut you off for good. Don't play your little games with me." I bit my lip and nodded. I knew I could no longer expect any concern from him. In my son's eyes, I was no longer his mother. I was nothing but a burden, an extra piece of furniture. Mia continued to treat me like an unpaid servant. In the morning, she handed me a list of chores, in the evening, she checked to see if I'd done them. One day, I was too tired to finish the laundry, and she sneered. "If you can't do it, then leave. There's no place for lazy people here." I wanted to speak, but my throat closed tight. I was afraid. Not of Mia, but of Lucas's hands, the hands that had choked me, drenched me with dirty water, ripped my hair. James gradually began avoiding me. He still looked at me with pity, but he no longer ran to hug me. I knew he was being brainwashed. One day he whispered, "Dad said Grandma doesn't love me, that Grandma just likes yelling at Mom." I sank to the floor, covering my face. I wanted to scream that I loved him more than my own life, but I was afraid of confusing him more. I only stroked his hair softly, my voice choked. "No matter what anyone says, Grandma still loves you." He stayed silent, then ran off. The distance between us stretched further and further, like a taut rope pulling us apart. Mrs. Rose kept urging me to call the police. One afternoon she stopped by, looking at the bruises on my neck, sighing. "Emily, you have to do something. You can't keep living like this." I shook my head, eyes lowered. "I'm afraid of losing James. If I report them, they'll forbid me from seeing him." Mrs. Rose squeezed my hand tightly. "But if you stay, you'll lose yourself." I turned away, tears streaming down my face. I knew she was right, but my heart felt torn in two. Through the long nights, I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to Mia and Lucas laughing and chatting in their room, listening to James's gentle snoring from the next. I opened my journal and wrote trembling lines. I have become a ghost in my own family. Each passing day is another day of dying slowly. Sometimes, in my restless sleep, the image of my son's hand choking me returned with terrifying clarity, jolting me awake in cold sweat. I clutched the pillow, shivering like a child. I was afraid of my own flesh and blood, a fear I had never imagined I would one day experience. One night, I looked at my late husband's portrait and spoke as though pleading for help. "Darling, I'm so tired. I don't recognize our boy anymore. He's not my son anymore. Can you see? I'm slowly being erased from his life." No answer came, only the darkness enveloping me. Loneliness became a shadow that followed me everywhere. When I cooked, when I cleaned, when I walked James to school, it was all wrapped in silence. I had no one left to share with, no one left to call my name. I was like an invisible being, wandering in the very apartment I once dreamed would be a home. But in that silence, I began to see the truth. I could no longer save my son. I could not change Mia. The only one I could save was myself, and somehow, by saving myself, save James from this darkness too. Every night when I wrote in my journal, I recorded every detail, which day I was insulted, which day I was shoved, every threat, every bruise. I was no longer just writing to vent my pain. I was collecting evidence, though I didn't yet dare admit it to myself. In the depths of that absolute loneliness, I heard a small voice in my head, "Emily, you have lived your whole life for your son. Now you must live for yourself." That night, I closed my journal and looked in the mirror. The woman staring back was still me, but in her tired eyes there was something new, the glint of determination. I knew that one day soon, I would have to make a decision. I lay down and took a deep breath. Outside, the New York rain still tapped steadily, like the slow beat of fate's drum. Inside me, the tiny flame still smoldered. I whispered to myself, "Emily, you are not dead. You are not finished." And for the first time in months, I closed my eyes not to cry, but to picture a tomorrow, the day I would leave this hell and find myself again. After those long, restless nights, I realized that absolute loneliness was not the end but a wake-up call. I had hit the bottom of humiliation, and now there was only one choice: to rise. Not because I was no longer afraid, but because I had no other way. If I kept enduring, I would die in this apartment, die in front of James, leaving him with that horrific memory for the rest of his life. I began to think about leaving, but this time not just fleeing, escaping with dignity, with the protection of the law. I needed a plan. One morning, I used the excuse of taking James to school earlier than usual, then walked through another neighborhood. On a small street corner stood a modest law office with a simple sign, "Andrew and Associates." I stood frozen at the door, my hands trembling, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. The receptionist looked at me and asked softly, "How can we help you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "I need to see a lawyer, about housing rights and domestic abuse." A few minutes later, a tall, lean man in his 50s appeared. He introduced himself. "I'm Andrew. Please, tell me everything. Don't be afraid." For the first time in years, I felt seen and heard as a human being. I told him everything: selling my house to pay for my son's education, the fact that my name was on the apartment Lucas now lived in, the choking, the basin of water, being dragged to the balcony by my hair. I wept uncontrollably when I spoke about James. Andrew didn't interrupt. He listened carefully, taking notes, then said slowly, "You still have documents proving your ownership of the apartment. We can reclaim it. And with what you've told me, if you have evidence, we can file for domestic abuse." I looked at him, my heart pounding. For the first time, I heard words that opened a way out. I don't have much evidence, just a few bruises and my journals. I whispered. Andrew nodded. Then start from today. Record, film, save everything. Find a reliable witness. And most importantly, don't let them know what you're doing. I left with a packet of papers he handed me, listing the steps to take. On the way home, I clutched it like a lifeline. That evening, I spoke with Mrs. Rose. I told her about the plan. Her eyes lit up, unwavering. Emily, I'll help you. I'll be your witness. And I have a mini camera my grandson gave me, we can hide it. We planned everything carefully. Mrs. Rose would help me set up the camera in the kitchen, where most arguments happened. I would continue to keep my journal, photograph every bruise. I also secretly prepared a temporary place to stay in New Orleans. The small apartment I once rented for workers was still vacant. Every step had to be silent. By day, I still cooked, cleaned, took James to school like before. By night, I gathered papers, photographed documents, and sealed them in plastic bags hidden at the bottom of a drawer. Each time I heard Lucas's footsteps, my heart pounded, terrified he would discover me. Once, James caught me arranging things. He tilted his head and asked, "Abuela, where are you going?" I choked back tears, hugging him tightly, inhaling the sweet scent of his hair. "One day you'll understand. I just want you to be safe, to be truly loved." He looked at me, his eyes sad, but said nothing more. I knew he sensed something was changing, even if he didn't understand. During those days of preparation, I felt something new inside me, not exactly hope, but resolve. I was no longer living just to endure. I had begun living to reclaim my right to exist. I was still afraid. Every time I saw Lucas's hands, I shivered, remembering the choking, the water, the hair pulling. But that fear was now tempered by clarity. I knew I had to stay calm, had to keep playing the submissive mother a little longer, so the plan could be completed. On those final nights, when James was asleep, I opened the window and looked out at the street. New York glowed bright in the darkness, cars rushing by, life carrying on as if this hellish apartment didn't exist. I inhaled deeply, closed my eyes, and pictured New Orleans, the narrow sunlit streets, the place where I would walk freely, without fear. In my journal, I wrote, "With each passing day, I step closer to freedom. I have lost a son, but I will not lose myself. I have lost a home, but I will build another, with my own hands." I set the pen down, closing the book. Inside my chest, the small flame was no longer smoldering, it was beginning to burn into light. I wasn't free yet, but I had stepped out of despair's shadow. And I knew, very soon, my day would come, the day I would leave this hell, head held high, and tell my story as a reminder to all who are buried under abuse: never let them erase who you are. The day I decided to act, the New York sky was startlingly blue, impossibly clear. Inside me, though, storms raged. Weeks of secret preparation, the papers, the videos, the journal entries, everything was finally ready. I knew I could no longer delay. That morning, I quietly left the apartment while Mia was taking James to school and Lucas was still asleep. In my bag was a thick stack of documents, photos of bruises, video clips Mrs. Rose had helped me record. I went straight to Attorney Andrew's office. He greeted me with a serious but warm gaze. "Emily, you've done well. Today we'll file the official complaint." Hearing those words, my hands trembled. I had never imagined I would one day accuse my own son. But then I remembered the hand that had choked me, the basin of dirty water thrown in my face, James's terrified cries as he saw me dragged out to the balcony. A strange surge of strength rose inside me, pushing me forward. Andrew went with me to the police station. We filed a domestic violence report, attaching the photos and video evidence. I signed the statement, each stroke shaky but resolute. The officers listened, their doubt vanishing once they saw the clip: Lucas screaming, grabbing my hair, dragging me to the balcony, James crying out in terror. One officer nodded. Don't worry, ma'am. We'll take action immediately. That afternoon, as I sat with Mrs. Rose in my apartment, a knock thundered at the door. 2 police officers appeared, stern-faced. "Mr. Lucas, you are required to come with us to the station." I stood in the corner, my heart pounding. Mia panicked, screaming. "What is this? Who dares destroy my family?" I stepped forward, my voice strangely calm. "You destroyed it long ago." Lucas stared at me, his eyes filled with anger and disbelief. But this time, he had no power. The officers held him firmly between them and led him away as the neighbors looked on curiously. Murmurs rose in the hallway. I heard them clearly. The son strangled his own mother. My God, unbelievable. Mia clutched James, sobbing, but I knew those tears were not for love of her husband, they were tears of fear at losing her financial support. James, though, was different. He didn't run to hug his father as before. He stood pressed against the wall, watching with confused eyes, then turned to me as if searching for an answer. The very next day, Andrew helped me freeze the joint account that Lucas's name had once been attached to. That money was everything I had saved over the years, and now I took it back, no longer to be stolen. The preliminary ruling came quickly. With proof of ownership, I reclaimed the apartment, the very place where I had long been treated like an uninvited guest. When I held the court decision in my hand, I trembled. I could hardly believe I had won back what was mine through the power of the law. Mia wailed, clutching at my arm as if begging. "Mother, please forgive us. Whatever you want, we'll do it." I looked straight into her eyes, my voice icy. "I only want one thing, freedom. And that leaves no place for you." I left the apartment in front of the neighbors. Not in shame, but with my head held high. I heard Mrs. Rose whisper, "Emily, you've won." That night, I slept in New Orleans, in the small apartment Andrew had helped me rent temporarily. No more shouting, no more contemptuous stares, no more hands tightening around my throat. I exhaled, feeling as if I had just escaped a steel cage. James sent me a drawing by mail. In it, he sketched a grandmother and a child holding hands under a blue sky. At the bottom, in his childish scrawl, were the words, "I love Grandma." I pressed the drawing to my chest, tears falling, but this time, they were tears of relief. Lucas remained in custody under investigation. Mia, without her husband's support, was lost, no longer with the money she once flaunted. Neighbors told me they argued constantly, blaming each other. But none of that mattered to me anymore. In my journal, I wrote, "I fought back, not with violence, but with truth and justice. I lost a son, but I did not lose myself. I saved myself, and I saved James from the darkness." I set the pen down and sighed. For the first time in months, I felt peace in my heart. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but I also knew this: from now on, I was no longer afraid. I had dared to face it, dared to rise. And I would walk this path to the end. I left New York on a cool, clear morning, clutching my small suitcase. It didn't hold much, just a few clothes, my journal, legal documents, and James's drawing. But to me, it was everything, a new beginning. I boarded the train back to New Orleans, my heart trembling yet unburdened. For the first time in years, I no longer felt like a shadow in that apartment. I was Emily, the woman who still had the right to live for herself. New Orleans welcomed me with a blue sky and warm sunlight. I inhaled deeply, the faint scent of jasmine drifting along the narrow streets. I rented back my old apartment, the one I had once leased to workers. It was small, modest, but it was mine, entirely mine. I rearranged the space, a single bed, a wooden table, a few old photographs. That humble home brought me the peace New York had stolen. In the first days, I had to relearn how to live alone. In the mornings, I went to the market nearby, choosing fresh vegetables, listening to the familiar cries of the vendors. In the afternoons, I wandered the square, watching children play, hearing jazz melodies float from a little bar. I felt my heart slowly soften, being healed by the simple rhythm of life. One day, I passed the community cultural center. A small sign caught my eye: creative writing class for seniors, begins next week. I froze. For so long, I had been writing in my journal, recording only my pain. But writing to share, to turn sorrow into a story that was something new. I signed up. At the first class, I held my pen nervously, surrounded by unfamiliar yet friendly faces. The instructor, a woman in her 40s, smiled. "Here, we write to live again, to heal. Begin with your own story." And I wrote. I wrote about Lucas's hand, about the basin of dishwater, about the cold balcony. I wrote about James, his terrified eyes. I wrote about nights with tear-soaked pillows, about absolute loneliness. When I read it back, my heart trembled, but I also felt a strange strength. The words were not just wounds, they were proof that I had survived. Mrs. Rose kept in touch. Sometimes she called, updating me about New York. Mia had collapsed, no longer with anyone to shield her. Neighbors looked at their family with disdain. I only listened, then said quietly, "It's over. I won't go back." I refused all of Lucas's calls. Whether he wept, begged, or raged, I didn't answer. I no longer wanted to hear that voice, the one that had screamed at me, the one that forbade me to scold his wife by strangling me. I needed no forgiveness, no remorse. I only needed freedom. What warmed my heart most was James. He sent me many drawings. One showed a grandmother and grandson walking under golden sunlight. Another, a small house with the words, "Grandma's home." I knew then that in his young heart, the love for his grandmother remained, never lost. It was the bond that kept me going, the proof that true love cannot be broken by lies. Every afternoon, I go to the square in New Orleans and sit on the familiar stone bench. I watch the children playing, listen to the jazz music echoing, and gaze at the radiant sunlight painting the white walls gold. I lift my head high, breathe deeply, and feel freedom weaving into every breath. In my journal, I now write words unlike those of the past: "I have lost a son, but I have found myself again. I have lost a home, but I have found a new place for my soul." Rebirth does not come from miracles, but from the determination to rise. I began writing a memoir. Not just to recount the pain, but to speak to other women: do not remain silent. Do not let abuse erase you. Each page I write is another step toward liberation, a cleansing of the lingering darkness. The day I completed the first chapter, I walked out to the square and stood under the dazzling sunlight of New Orleans. I felt my body grow light, as if I had just been born again. I was no longer the old woman who had been strangled, drenched with filthy water, dragged across the balcony. I was Emily, the one who rose from the ruins, reborn. I smiled, lifted my head high, and let the sunlight shine directly on my face. Inside, a whisper echoed: "Life does not end when we fall, but when we refuse to rise." And I, Emily, have risen. My story is not only the tragedy of a mother, but also a warning for anyone living in the shadows of abuse. Silence only feeds cruelty, while courage opens the path to freedom. I have lost, I have broken, but I also found myself within that pain. The greatest lesson: love does not mean submission. We have the right to say enough, the right to stand and protect our dignity. And when we do, we not only save ourselves, we plant light for the generations to come.